Okay, so I'm gonna try and keep this brief, but I've been playing Pokemon Sword, and I find it to be a pretty decent Pokemon game. Some of the things I like about the game are 1. Its roster. We have some cool new Pokemon like Corviknight, Dreadnought, Dragapult, Flapple, Grapploct, and a personal favorite of mine, Barraskewda. There are a few Pokemon that are going to take a little more time to grow on me, like Poltegeist and Boltund, but for the most part I do like the roster, as there are a few other Pokemon I really love that I didn't mention. Second, I definitely love that you don't have to go through every individual level when leveling up lower leveled Pokemon. Please keep this change for later games. The return of gyms is something I really appreciate, as it makes these new characters a bit more memorable for me in comparison to the trial captains from Alola. Sorry, I really didn't care too much for the trials and totem Pokemon in the Sun and Moon games. Some of my favorite gym leaders from Galar are Kabu, Nessa, Pierce, and Raihan, I think is how you pronounce it, who, by the way, is a much better double battle gym than Liza and Tate. I'm very happy they finally brought a double battle gym back. Overworld encounters are a neat idea, and I'm so happy you can catch trait evolution Pokemon like Gigalith and Dusklenor right there in the wild. And lastly, we have a unique twist on the Championship League that, while needlessly easy since you get healed every time you win a fight, it is still at least enjoyable, and I'm glad you get to rematch gym leaders. However, there are a lot of things I'm not all that into with this game. Why do the wallpapers in the PC box suck? Seriously, all the ones from generations 3 to 7 are really good. These ones are awful. Why make it where you have to run into an exclamation mark in grass encounters, which in turn makes these counters more annoying when looking for certain Pokemon, especially when the exclamation mark spawns right on top of an overworld Pokemon? Just make them actual random encounters like in the Alola region and all the other previous regions. It's not that bad, especially since you're given a lot of money in this game, so repels aren't that difficult to come across. Also, why aren't there 2 different kinds of repels? Repels for grass encounters and repels for overworld encounters, as still, overworld encounter Pokemon can get a little annoying, especially Girders in Route 8. I'm coming into terms with not having all the Pokemon in future games. It's just, Game Freak's reasoning for when Sword and Shield first coming out didn't come off as very honest, since all the previous Pokemon models are reused from the 3DS games. And it doesn't look like they added that many new animations, at least in terms of battles, as battles are still not quite as dynamic as they had been in, say, the Colosseum, XD, or even Battle Evolution games. The idea of restricted rosters would be a much easier pill to swallow if we're going to be given plenty of content in these upcoming games. And of course, why does Game Freak continue to mess up the multiplayer? The 3DS, at least Generation 6, had it like perfect, but here, there's no proper friend codes, no GTS, and just a really crappy trade system altogether. I discussed this issue with my friend, and he did mention that this could be just, you know, the growing pains of being on the Switch, which is kind of understandable, but the PSS was like perfectly fine. Why not continue to try to build off of that rather than coming up with these lesser ideal solutions? If anything, I think something like the Union Room would be a much better alternative, especially since we have basically fast travel now. But these are just the small issues. My biggest issue with this game is its region. First, let me say I think there are some cool locations, and that I think there is a lot of potential with what they have. However, this is such a boring region to explore. I'm sure this is gonna come down to personal taste, I understand that. It's just that one of my favorite things to do in these games is explore and immerse myself in its given region. For example, my favorite region is Hoenn. Not just because there's plenty of places to explore, though that does help, but there's also much more to do in the region, like contests and secret bases. Don't get me wrong, Hoenn does have its issues, like how almost all the sea routes have the same encounters, and there's a lot of sea routes, so that makes them kind of boring, at least in terms of catching Pokemon. Unfortunately, these types of extra content, like musical, contests, Pokeathlon, Battle Frontiers, PWT, and the one I love the most, Secret Bases, have mostly been dropped from the series, which sucks. but I don't expect to see these kind of things anymore. However, I have still found the new regions interesting to at least explore, so let me try and explain why I don't enjoy Galar as much as I wish I could. Part 1. The towns. A small issue for me would be a few of the cities. Mostly, all of these buildings you don't get to explore. No houses or any interesting buildings in Motostoke. The castle you can't even visit in Hammerlock, and Winden having a Ferris wheel you can't even reach and a hotel you don't get to explore as opposed to the other hotels within the very same game. Keep in mind, Innova gave us a Ferris wheel that we could ride and battle trainers on as well. Then we have Spikemuth. A cool looking town that's no more than just a hallway. I mean, at least Po Town in Alola had a mansion with rooms to check out and a slight puzzle aspect to it. Plus, you had to be kinda sneaky when getting in. Not to mention, you can't even explore the gyms in Galar after you've beaten them, which is a bit of a disappointment for me, as I found the water gym's interior kind of neat, despite how super simple it is. Previous games with gyms still let you run around in them after beating them. Plus, Turffield really could have used a shop or something other than just the hill to help make the town more memorable. I understand the first two towns being small, but come on. Part 2. The routes. A bigger issue for me is with the routes. Now, yes, this is a very linear game with extremely linear routes. And to be fair, there are linear and short routes in previous games as well. The difference here though is that Galar's routes don't branch off to other locations or create unique ways to travel to previous locations via HMs. Alola is another linear region, but it still completely outshines Galar thanks to how much the routes branch off to other locations or how they loop back in on each other in unique and interesting ways. For example, from Route 3, you can head back to Route 2, or head south to Route 1, or go to the Melee Meadow, which in of itself leads to Seaward Cave, which then leads to Kala's Bay, a location you can even see from Route 3. While in Galar, almost all of the routes only lead to two locations, one on one end and another on the other. Not to mention, many of these routes are linear with boring layouts. Compare Route 3 in Galar with its straightforward path that leads to a cave with very tiny amounts of branching off to Route 30 in Johto, where you have a couple of bodies of water, a couple of houses to visit, and while the route is somewhat linear, you aren't walking in just a straight line, and actually have to think about which path you're going to take depending on which HMs you have, as there are a couple shortcuts. Now, I don't think HMs should return, but I wish Pokeride did, to at least make some of these areas more engaging. I mean, look at Route 12 here from Alola. Sure, it's still simple, but at least there is some alternate pathing, and you do have to bring something else along to traverse the area. It's a little bit more engaging. Galar at least has a few routes that are more interesting to traverse, like Route 6 with its somewhat branching paths, 8 with its ruin section and adorable use of the Phalanx Pokemon, and 9 with Sir Chester Bay that actually has some alternate pathing and is, for me, the best route in the game because it at least feels like a place you can explore compared to every other route, almost. It's times like this I wish Pokemon went back to its grid style layout like in Generation 6 and below. Kalos certainly has plenty of linear routes, but since there are so many more routes, it doesn't feel quite as much of an issue. And thanks to the use of HMs, offered much more in terms of exploration and a reason to return to routes like 5, 14, 15, 19, and 21. Though, to be fair, many of Kalos' routes are very short, and rideable Pokemon were often needlessly slow. Still, I can't help but to find more of the routes layouts of the grid-style games more interesting since they were often more mindful of grass patches, ledge placement, and HM obstacles. That's not to say the older games had perfect routes, but this issue feels more present due to how few routes there are in Galar, 10 to be exact. Part 3. Where are all the interesting locations? Then we have a big issue. A lack of interesting locations. Galar has only 2 caves and 2 forests, and that's it. Keep in mind, I'm not including routes here, but compare that to Kalos, where between routes and towns we have Santaloon Forest, Perfume Palace, Connecting Cave, Glittering Cave, Reflection Cave, Azure Bay, Lost Hotel, Frost Cavern, and Terminus Cave. That's like 10 locations. I'm using Kalos as an example here, since it's the first main series game to be in 3D, and was the first of the Pokemon games on the 3DS. And I feel like that's fair, as Pokemon Sword is a 3D game, and is the first main series Pokemon game on the Switch. Let's Go was a spin-off, mostly. Galar is just lacking in more unique locations, not to mention what caves it does have are far too simple in terms of their layout. Heck, we don't even have a victory road, just a lackluster series of tedious fights on our way to fight the champion, and an extremely tiny power plant that doesn't even come close to comparing to Team Flare's hideout or Team Rocket's. Alola had some simple caves too, but at least it has more than what Galar has to offer. Plus, the vast Pony Canyon felt like more of a proper dungeon towards the end of the game than the Slumbering Weld, which I still do like that forest, and I think it was cool to have it near the starting town. It's just lacking in comparison. It's kind of a shame too, because when you get to the Galar Mine 1, it looks kinda cool. It's a neat concept, it's really gold and I like that, with all those gems, and the whole minecart thing is kinda neat. What's a big shame to me is that when you get to that pseudo bridge area and you see that lower section, it makes you think you can go to that lower section, but you never can. It's really disappointing. They really should have given us some items to act as HMs, because a lack of HM puzzles or obstacles is making traversing these new games so boring. I don't hate any of the 4 unique locations in Galar. I just wish there was more to them, or we had more to explore, as there's nothing like the Pokemon Mansion, Old Chateau, Sea Mauville / Abandoned Ship, or even Celestial Tower. None of these extra locations that help add to the lore of each town or just the region in general. What also doesn't help my lack of immersion is the town map. Galar's town map is awful. There are no details given to you about towns, the forests or caves, or the routes. Having some extra pieces of info to the locations of the region from the town maps has been a thing since the DS games. Not to mention, there are no new locations to explore in post-game or any optional routes. Unlike previous games which had plenty of optional locations to visit, like the power plant, Shoal Cave, and the Lost Hotel, then we have locations or areas that open up to you in the post-game, such as Mount Silver, Resort Area, and Resolution Cave. Part 4. The Bland Area. And lastly, we have the Wild Area, which to me, probably the reason why the region sucks. Sure, it's neat to have a place where you can interact with friends and other people while seeing them in an in-game location, but when it comes to exploring the Wild Area, it's boring. There are no dungeons, caves, or forests anywhere. Most of it is just simple hills, flat land, some water, and uninteractable set pieces. It's an area mostly made for raids and catching Pokemon, with its kind of dumb weather gimmick. At least Seasons and Unova completely changed the look and layout of certain locations. The weather here just feels like a cheap overlay and doesn't really add much to the area at all. I'm sorry, but I really don't get why they gave this some extra attention. I don't want to hate on raids though. It's a decent idea that can be entertaining with friends and can be a good way to get EXP, sell-worthy items, and TRs. After all, it's raids that the Wild Area was mostly made for. But to me, the Wild Area is just a glorified Safari Zone, except less fun. Sure, Heart Gold and Soul Silver had a simple Safari Zone, but at least you got to customize it. There are technically different locations in the Wild Area, but it's just to differentiate what weather is happening where and what Pokemon you can catch. None of these locations have some lore that I've found that, isn't about the Darkest Day thing, or any kind of connection to the cities that lead into the Wild Area. You'll see a large tower in the distance in the Watchtower Ruins section, but when you get to it, you'll find there isn't anything to do there, and it holds no significance. I will say I do appreciate respawning items in the wild area. It kind of reminds me of Treasure Beach from the Sevi Islands. I wish there were more areas like this in Pokemon to get continuous use out of each game's own item finder or dowsing machine, which of course this game doesn't have. But hey, you can hang out with your friends here and camp together, and I don't mind the camp feature. It's charming. I enjoy playing with my Pokemon and cooking these curries. I just wish this area was more interesting, like maybe having catching contests. Seriously, how is Johto the only region with a catching contest and a series about catching creatures? What I mean to say when I think that the wild area is the crux of why the region sucks is I think because it's such a new concept that the development team put a lot of effort into trying to at least get it functional and getting the idea stable. And this came at a cost of making the rest of the region more engaging and interesting because it's such a new concept and it is a big selling point of the game. And I get its growing pains and it is an interesting idea, and I really think it should be the Safari Zones of later games, including remakes. But it just sucks to have such a lackluster region with so little to explore and such simple routes. Well, I think I've gone on long enough, but I hope that explains some of my disappointment with this region. There are other things that annoy me, like not being able to grow berries, the Pokejobs being a worse version of Pokepelago, you can't catch wild Pokemon at certain levels depending on what badges you have, which is kinda dumb. Team Yell being the absolute worst quote-unquote villain team, like are they even villains at this point? And being a bit mixed on the existence of TRs, or you know, at least not being able to purchase the ones I want at some special shops with in-game money rather than Watts. Didn't really like Watts that much. But the lack of an interesting region is really my biggest issue, and I hope these games get a Pokemon Black 2 or Platinum treatment, like truly expand the possibilities of this region. I really want to see Game Freak give this region another try, and we get some improved versions of Sword and Shield. However, I need to stress that I don't want to see these improved versions like next year. I want Game Freak to take their time with it to truly make a great game, because honestly, we don't need a new Pokemon game every year. I don't think it's wrong to expect better of Game Freak, especially when we've seen them do better. But hey, this is still a fun Pokemon game. It's just lacking quite greatly in comparison to previous games. I'll see you guys next time with my Ape Escape 3 countdown. I just really had to get this off my chest. And I know it's a different kind of video than what I typically make, but I just kinda had to get this out there. And I do plan on doing some more unique videos like this in the future. One specifically about Klonoa 2. But until then, I'll see you guys next time.